Anti-terrorism is, in its broadest sense, the use or threatened use of violence in order to achieve a political, religious, or ideological aim. It is classified as fourth-generation warfare and is a violent crime. In modern times, terrorism is considered a major threat to society and therefore illegal under anti-terrorism laws in most jurisdictions. It is also considered a war crime under the laws of war when used to target non-combatants, such as civilians, neutral military personnel, or enemy prisoners of war. A broad array of political organizations have practiced terrorism to further their objectives. It has been practiced by both right-wing and left-wing political organizations, nationalist groups, religious groups, revolutionaries, and ruling governments. The symbolism of terrorism can exploit human fear to help achieve these goals. According to data from the Global Terrorism Database, more than 61,000 incidents of non-state terrorism claiming over 140,000 lives have been recorded from 2000 to 2014. Terminology. Origin of term terrorism comes from the French word terrorisme, and originally referred specifically to state terrorism as practiced by the French government during the 1793 to 1794 Reign of Terror. The French word terrorisme in turn derives from the Latin verb terrere, meaning to frighten. The terror Cimbricus was a panic and state of emergency in Rome in response to the approach of warriors of the Cimbri tribe in 105 BCE that the Jacobins cited as a precedent when imposing the Reign of Terror during the French Revolution. After the Jacobins lost power, the word terrorist became a term of abuse. Although terrorism originally referred to acts committed by government, currently it usually refers to the killing of innocent people for political purposes in such a way as to create a spectacle. This meaning can be traced back to Sergei Nechayev, who described himself as a terrorist. Nechayev founded the Russian terrorist group People's Retribution in 1869. The lack of consensus as to what a terrorist is affects policies designed to deal with terrorists. Some view them as soldiers that can be held at the end of a war and are entitled to various privileges spelled out in the Geneva Conventions. Others view them as criminals that should be tried in civil courts. Still others will argue that terrorists are best treated as a category to themselves and need policies tailored to them. This is the case because A. they often cannot be prosecuted because they commit suicide, and B. prevention is more important than punishment. In November 2004, a Secretary General of the United Nations report described terrorism as any act intended to cause death or serious bodily harm to civilians or non-combatants with the purpose of intimidating a population or compelling a government or an international organization to do or abstain from doing any act. Definition. The definition of terrorism has proven controversial. Various legal systems and government agencies use different definitions of terrorism in the national legislation. Moreover, the international community has been slow to formulate a universally agreed, legally binding definition of this crime. These difficulties arise from the fact that the term terrorism is politically and emotionally charged. In this regard, Angus Martin, briefing the Australian Parliament, stated, "The international community has never succeeded in developing an accepted comprehensive definition of terrorism." During the 1970s and 1980s, the United Nations attempts to define the term floundered mainly due to differences of opinion between various members about the use of violence in the context of conflicts over national liberation and self-determination. These divergences have made made it impossible for the United Nations to conclude a comprehensive convention on international terrorism that incorporates a single, all-encompassing, legally binding, criminal law definition of terrorism. The international community has adopted a series of sectoral conventions that define and criminalize various types of terrorist activities. Since 1994, the United Nations General Assembly has repeatedly condemned terrorist acts using the following political description of terrorism: criminal acts intended or calculated to provoke a state of terror in the public, a group of persons or particular persons for political purposes are in any circumstance unjustifiable, whatever the considerations of a political, philosophical, ideological, racial, ethnic, religious or any other nature that may be invoked to justify them. U.S. Code Title 22, Chapter 38, Section 2656F defines terrorism as premeditated, politically motivated violence perpetrated against non-combatant targets by subnational groups or clandestine agents, usually intended to influence an audience. Bruce Hoffman, a scholar, has noted, it is not only individual agencies within the same governmental apparatus that cannot agree on a single definition of terrorism. Experts and other long-established scholars in the field are equally incapable of reaching a consensus. In the first edition of his magisterial survey, Political Terrorism, a Research Guide, Alex Schmid devoted more than 100 pages to examining more than 100 different definitions of terrorism in an effort to discover a broadly acceptable, reasonably comprehensive explication of the word. 4 years and a second edition later, Schmid was no closer to the goal of his quest, conceding in the first sentence of the revised volume that the search for an adequate definition is still on. Walter Laqueur despaired of defining terrorism in both editions of his monumental work on the subject, maintaining that it is neither possible to discern nor worthwhile to make the attempt. Hoffman believes it is possible to identify some key characteristics of terrorism. He proposes that, by distinguishing terrorists from other types of criminals and terrorism from other forms of crime, we come to appreciate that terrorism is ineluctably political in aims and motives. Violent, or equally important, threatens violence, designed to have far-reaching psychological repercussions beyond the immediate victim or target, conducted either by an organization with an identifiable chain of command, a conspiratorial cell structure, or by individuals or a small collection of individuals directly influenced, motivated, or inspired by the ideological aims or example of some existent terrorist movement and/or its leaders, and perpetrated by a subnational group or non-state entity. A definition proposed by Carsten Bockstedt at the George C. Marshall European Center for Security Studies underlines the psychological and tactical aspects of terrorism. Terrorism is defined as political violence in an asymmetrical conflict that is designed to induce terror and psychic fear through the violent victimization and destruction of non-combatant targets. Such acts are meant to send a message from an illicit clandestine organization. The purpose of terrorism is to exploit the media in order to achieve maximum attainable publicity as an amplifying force multiplier in order to influence the targeted audience in order to reach short and mid-term political goals and/or desired long-term end states. Each act of terrorism is a performance devised to affect many large audiences. Terrorists also attack national symbols to show power and to attempt to shake the foundation of the country or society they are opposed to. This may negatively affect a government, while increasing the prestige of the given terrorist group and/or ideology behind a terrorist act. Terrorist acts frequently have a political purpose. This is often where the interrelationship between terrorism and religion occurs, when a political struggle is integrated into the framework of a religious or cosmic struggle, such as over the control of an ancestral homeland, a holy site such as Israel and Jerusalem. Failing in the political goal becomes equated with spiritual failure, which, for the highly committed, is worse than their own death or the deaths of innocent civilians. The suffering accomplishes the terrorists' goals of instilling fear, getting the message out to an audience, or otherwise satisfying the demands of their often radical religious and political agendas. Some official governmental definitions of terrorism use the criterion of the illegitimacy or unlawfulness of the act, to distinguish between actions authorized by a government and those of other actors, including individuals and small groups. For example, carrying out a strategic bombing on an enemy city, which is designed to affect civilian support for a cause, would not be considered terrorism if it were authorized by a government. This criterion is inherently problematic and is not universally accepted, because it denies the existence of state terrorism. The same act may or may not be classed as terrorism depending on whether its sponsorship is traced to a legitimate government, legitimacy, and lawfulness, or subjective, depending on the perspective of one government or another, and it diverges from the historically accepted meaning and origin of the term. According to Ali Khan, the distinction lies ultimately in a political judgment. An associated and arguably more easily definable, but not equivalent term is violent non-state actor. The semantic scope of this term includes not only terrorists, but while excluding some individuals or groups who have previously been described as terrorists, and also explicitly excludes state terrorism. Barack Obama, commenting on the Boston Marathon bombings of April 2013, declared that NY-time bombs are used to target innocent civilians. It is an act of terror. Various commentators have pointed out the distinction between act of terror and terrorism, particularly when used by the White House. 18 U.S.C. Section 2331 defines international terrorism and domestic terrorism for purposes of Chapter 113b of the Code, entitled Terrorism. International terrorism means activities with the following three characteristics: involve violent acts or acts dangerous to human life that violate federal or state law, appear to be intended to intimidate or coerce a civilian population, to influence the policy of a government by intimidation or coercion, or to affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction, assassination, or kidnapping, and occur primarily outside the territorial jurisdiction of the U.S. or transnational boundaries in terms of the means by which they are accomplished, the persons they appear intended to intimidate or coerce, or the locale in which the perpetrators operate or seek asylum. Pejorative use. The terms terrorism and terrorist carry strong negative connotations. These terms are often used as political labels to condemn violence or the threat of violence by certain actors as immoral, indiscriminate, unjustified, or to condemn an entire segment of a population. Those labeled terrorists by their opponents rarely identify themselves as such, and typically use other terms or terms specific to the situation, such as separatist, freedom fighter, liberator, revolutionary, vigilante, militant, paramilitary, guerrilla, rebel, patriot, or any similar meaning word in other languages and cultures. Jihadi, mujahideen, and fedayeen are similar Arabic words that have entered the English lexicon. It is common for both parties in a conflict to describe each other as terrorists, on whether particular terrorist acts, such as killing non-combatants, can be justified as the lesser evil in a particular circumstance. Philosophers have expressed different views. While, according to David Rodin, utilitarian philosophers can conceive of cases in which the evil of terrorism is outweighed by the good that could not be achieved in a less morally costly way. In practice, the harmful effects of undermining the convention of non-combatant immunity is thought to outweigh the goods that may be achieved by particular acts of terrorism. Among the non-utilitarian philosophers, Michael Walzer argued that terrorism can be morally justified in only one specific case: when a nation or community faces the extreme threat of complete destruction, and the only way it can preserve itself is by intentionally targeting non-combatants. Then it is morally entitled to do so. In his book Anti-Terrorism, Bruce Hoffman offered an explanation of why the term terrorism becomes distorted. On one point, at least, everyone agrees terrorism is a pejorative term. It is a word with intrinsically negative connotations that is generally applied to one's enemies and opponents, or to those with whom one disagrees and would otherwise prefer to ignore. What is called terrorism, Brian Jenkins has written, thus seems to depend on one's point of view. Use of the term implies a moral judgment, and if one party can successfully attach the label terrorist to its opponent, then it has indirectly persuaded others to adopt its moral viewpoint. Hence, the decision to call someone or label some organization terrorist becomes almost unavoidably subjective, depending largely on whether one sympathizes with or opposes the person, group, cause concerned. If one identifies with the victim of the violence, for example, then the act is terrorism. If, however, one identifies with the perpetrator, the violent act is regarded in a more sympathetic, if not positive light, and it is not terrorism. The pejorative connotations of the word can be summed up in the aphorism, "One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter." This is exemplified when a group using irregular military methods is an ally of a state against a mutual enemy, but later falls out with the state and starts to use those methods against its former ally. During World War II, the Malayan People's Anti-Japanese Army was allied with the British, but during the Malayan Emergency, members of its successor were branded terrorists by the British. More recently, Ronald Reagan and others in the American administration frequently called the Afghan Mujahideen freedom fighters during the war against the Soviet Union. Yet 20 years later, when a new generation of Afghan men are fighting against what they perceive to be a regime installed by foreign powers, their attacks were labeled terrorism by George W. Bush. Groups accused of terrorism understandably prefer terms reflecting legitimate military or ideological action. Leading terrorism researcher Professor Martin Rudner, director of the Canadian Centre of Intelligence and Security Studies at Ottawa's Carleton University, defines terrorist acts as unlawful attacks for political or other ideological goals, and said, "There is the famous statement, 'One man's terrorist is another man's freedom fighter,' but that is grossly misleading. It assesses the validity of the cause when terrorism is an act. One can have a perfectly beautiful cause, and yet if one commits terrorist acts, it is terrorism regardless." Some groups, when involved in their liberation struggle, have been called terrorists by the Western governments or media. Later, these same persons, as leaders of the liberated nations, are called statesmen by similar organizations. Two examples of this phenomenon of the Nobel Peace Prize laureates Menachem Begin and Nelson Mandela. WikiLeaks editor Julian Assange has been called a terrorist by Sarah Palin and Joe Biden. Sometimes, states that are close allies, for reasons of history, culture and politics, can disagree over whether or not members of a certain organization are terrorists. For instance, for many years, some branches of the United States government refused to label members of the Provisional Irish Republican Army as terrorists, while the IRA was using methods against one of the United States' closest allies that the UK branded as terrorism. This was highlighted by the Quinn v. Robinson case. Media outlets who wish to convey impartiality may limit the usage of terrorist and terrorism because they are loosely defined, potentially controversial in nature, and subjective terms. History. Depending on how broadly the term is defined, the roots and practice of terrorism can be traced at least to the 1st century AD. Sicarii Zealots, though some dispute whether the group, a radical offshoot of the Zealots which was active in Judea province at the beginning of the 1st century AD, was in fact terrorist, according to the contemporary Jewish Roman historian Josephus, after the Zealotry rebellion against Roman rule in Judea. When some prominent collaborators with Roman rule were killed, Judas of Galilee formed a small and more extreme offshoot of the Zealots, the Sicarii, in 06 AD. The terror also was directed against Jewish collaborators, including temple priests, Sadducees, Herodians, and other wealthy elites. The term terrorism itself was originally used to describe the actions of the Jacobin Club during the Reign of Terror in the French Revolution. Terror is nothing other than justice, prompt, severe, inflexible, said Jacobin leader Maximilien Robespierre. In 1795, Edmund Burke denounced the Jacobins for letting thousands of those hellhounds called terrorists loose on the people of France. In January 1858, Italian patriot Felice Orsini threw 3 bombs in an attempt to assassinate French Emperor Napoleon III. 8 bystanders were killed and 142 injured. The incident played a crucial role as an inspiration for the development of the early terrorist groups. Arguably the first organization to utilize modern terrorist techniques was the Irish Republican Brotherhood, founded in 1858 as a revolutionary Irish nationalist group that carried out attacks in England. The group initiated the Fenian Dynamite Campaign in 1881, one of the first modern terror campaigns. Instead of earlier forms of terrorism based on political assassination, this campaign used modern, timed explosives with the express aim of sowing fear in the very heart of metropolitan Britain in order to achieve political gains. Another early terrorist group was Narodnaya Volia, founded in Russia in 1878 as a revolutionary anarchist group inspired by Sergei Nechayev and propaganda by the deed theorist Pisacane. The group developed ideas, such as targeted killing of the leaders of oppression, that were to become the hallmark of subsequent violence by small, non-state groups, and they were convinced that the developing technologies of the age, such as the invention of dynamite, which they were the first anarchist group to make widespread use of, enabled them to strike directly and with discrimination. Modern terrorism had largely taken shape by the turn of the 20th century. Infographics, types, depending on the country, the political system, and the time in history, the types of terrorism are varying. In early 1975, the Law Enforcement Assistant Administration in the United States formed the National Advisory Committee on Criminal Justice Standards and Goals. One of the 5 volumes that the committee wrote was titled Disorders and Terrorism, produced by the Task Force on Disorders and Terrorism under the direction of H.H.A. Cooper, director of the task force staff. The task force defines terrorism as a tactic or technique by means of which a violent act or the threat thereof is used for the prime purpose of creating overwhelming fear for coercive purposes. It classified disorders and terrorism into 6 categories. Civil disorder, a form of collective violence interfering with the peace, security, and normal functioning of the community. Political terrorism, violent criminal behavior designed primarily to generate fear in the community, or substantial segment of it, for political purposes. Non-political terrorism, terrorism that is not aimed at political purposes, purposes but which exhibits conscious design to create and maintain a high degree of fear for coercive purposes, but the end is individual or collective gain rather than the achievement of a political objective. Quasi-terrorism, the activities incidental to the commission of crimes of violence that are similar in form and method to genuine terrorism but which nevertheless lack its essential ingredient. It is not the main purpose of the quasi-terrorists to induce terror in the immediate victim as in the case of genuine terrorism, but the quasi-terrorist uses the modalities and techniques of the genuine terrorist and produce similar consequences and reaction. For example, the fleeing felon who takes hostages is a quasi-terrorist, whose methods are similar to those of the genuine terrorist but whose purposes are quite different. Limited political terrorism. Genuine political terrorism is characterized by a revolutionary approach. Limited political terrorism refers to acts of terrorism which are committed for ideological or political motives but which are not part of a concerted campaign to capture control of the state. Official state terrorism, referring to nations whose rule is based upon fear and oppression that reach similar to terrorism of such proportions. It may also be referred to as structural terrorism, defined broadly as terrorist acts carried out by governments in pursuit of political objectives, often as part of the foreign policy. Other sources have defined the typology of terrorism in different ways, for example, broadly classifying it into domestic terrorism and international terrorism, or using categories such as vigilante terrorism or insurgent terrorism. One way the typology of terrorism may be defined: political terrorism, sub-state terrorism, social revolutionary terrorism, nationalist separatist terrorism, religious extremist terrorism, religious fundamentalist terrorism, new religions terrorism, right-wing terrorism, left-wing terrorism, state-sponsored terrorism, regime or state terrorism, criminal terrorism, pathological terrorism, motivation of terrorists. Attacks on collaborators are used to intimidate people from cooperating with the state in order to undermine state control. This strategy was used in Ireland, in Kenya, in Algeria and in Cyprus during their independence struggles. Attacks on high-profile symbolic targets are used to incite counter-terrorism by the state to polarize the population. This strategy was used by Al-Qaeda in its attacks on the World Trade Center and the Pentagon in the United States on September 11, 2001. These attacks are also used to draw international attention to struggles that are otherwise unreported, such as the Palestinian airplane hijackings in 1970 and the South Moluccan hostage crisis in the Netherlands in 1975. Abraham suggests that terrorist organizations do not select terrorism for its political effectiveness. Individual terrorists tend to be motivated more by desire for social solidarity with other members of their organization than by political platforms or strategic objectives, which are often murky and undefined. Additionally, Michael Musso shows possible relationships between the type of economy within a country and ideology associated with terrorism. Some terrorists like Timothy McVeigh were motivated by revenge against the state for its actions against its citizens.